Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here, and I believe this is the last talk of the day, so I'll do my best to keep it interesting. A little bit of weed talk at the end of the day is always good. So yeah, obviously a sexy topic, but I'm going to do my very best as a clinician to give you the science that I'm aware of, what we know, what we don't know, what we think, what we don't think, and try to provide you with that information so you can make informed decision-making regarding your health for yourselves or your loved ones. So just really briefly about me, graduated medicine at Western in 2013, did family medicine residency, and I was really motivated to get into cannabis just because a lot of my patients in family practice were just using a lot of opioids. They were using a lot of benzodiazepines for chronic pain and anxiety, and I just felt like they kept coming back and we weren't really getting them better, and so I was really struggling to find effective medicines, and I wish I had access to more therapies and other things that unfortunately are very expensive, but a lot of them started to tell me about cannabis, and truthfully a lot of them were using it illegally, and I started to research it and learn about it, and unfortunately I wasn't educated about cannabis in medical school whatsoever, and when I started to educate myself, I became quite interested in its medicinal properties, and a lot of it was really confusing at first because I only knew the harms. I was only really educated on the harms of cannabis. And then when I started to educate myself on the benefits and I started to meet patients that were using it, I started to hear remarkable stories, people reducing their opioids or their other drugs, and I thought that my contribution would be to become an expert as much as possible in this and try to help patients get information, because where they were getting their information wasn't accurate. The products they were using weren't necessarily legal or regulated or controlled. And so my job, I felt, was if they wanted to use cannabis and I felt it was appropriate, I would help guide them and give them the right products and advocate for them. And so that's really what motivated me. And I actually pretty much do almost pediatrics now exclusively. Pediatric cancers, pediatric autism, and pediatric epilepsy is predominantly what I do now with cannabis. And so it's a very, very small group of us that does that. So just a disclosure, as a physician, I do have an interest in Aleafia Cannabis, which is a medical company. I have received honoraria from industry in the past for speaking on the topic of cannabis. I've done over probably 3,000 to 4,000 consultations now with cannabis. I've been fortunate to travel the world and speak to regulators and parliaments about how to come up with laws around cannabis. And I've done a lot of legal examinations in the cannabis space. So I'm going to do my best to walk you through a patient case, talk a little bit about cannabis, talk about the science and the evidence, what we know, what we don't know, talk about the different methods of consumption of cannabis, the risks, benefits, and harms of cannabis. And again, we don't have all the answers, and you're going to hear that theme a lot today. We're going to talk a little bit about what the legal medical channel looks like, because there's confusion often. Talk briefly about harm reduction and what that looks like, and then we'll review that case again. Okay, so I like to look through the lens of a patient, and so this is Peter, who has myeloma. He's a 72-year-old male, and he was diagnosed after some blood work and imaging was done that demonstrated he had anemia, kidney issues, and some compression fractures in his spine. And so he was referred eventually to me to talk about how he could perhaps manage his chronic pain, insomnia, and anxiety. Those are three major symptoms he was dealing with. He was on a host of medications, but he felt like he didn't like the side effects, particularly the opioids were causing constipation. They were making him quite lethargic at times. And so he was referred to me and wanted to talk about cannabis and whether it could potentially help him. So let's shift gears. We'll come back to that case at the end. So a little bit about cannabis. So first, some definitions, just so we all are speaking the same language here. So cannabinoids are the compounds that act on the receptors in the human body. And endocannabinoids are the cannabinoids that your own body makes. And so as we sit here right now, our bodies are generating cannabis molecules that look just like the ones that are in the plant. And so those are called endocannabinoids. And those endocannabinoids work on a system called the endocannabinoid system. And then the phytocannabinoids are the ones that mimic the same ones that are in our body, such as THC and CBD, and they work on that endocannabinoid system in the body. And then there's synthetic cannabinoids as well, and so there are prescription medications with drug identification numbers that are in the same family as the medical cannabis flower plant. And so those are known as anabolone or it's called nabiximols, which is called Sativex. And so those are two drug identification number cannabinoid products that have some indications, and they've been approved for things like MS spasticity or cancer-related pain that didn't respond to opioids, for example. And there's actually recreational drugs, mostly in the United States, we don't see them, where they've been designed in a laboratory, and they're actually very harmful cannabinoids because they irreversibly bind to some of the receptors and cause seizures and addiction issues and a whole host of things. It's just important to know that there's a breadth of cannabinoids out there, natural, unnatural, synthetic, and all of them have different risks, benefits. So a little bit more about that endocannabinoid system. So this was one of the things that was puzzling to me as I started to look into medical cannabis, because this system of the body was never taught to me in medical school. And so I came out of medical school thinking, okay, I know it all. I know all the systems in the body. But the endocannabinoid system was something nobody ever taught me about. And so I had to go research it and learn for myself and read some primary journal articles and start to understand, well, what is an endocannabinoid system? And so the endocannabinoid system is a really complicated system, but once you understand it, what it's doing is it's trying to regulate a lot of the other systems in the body. It's almost like a parent system to other systems, and it tries to get them all to communicate. And essentially the goal is to try to promote what's called homeostasis. So a lot of this is energy homeostasis. And what homeostasis means, chemically, scientifically, we have an understanding of that we understand as clinicians, but what a patient experiences in homeostasis may be something that we don't fully understand, right? Might be a relaxed state, feeling a sense of well-being, calm, sleeping, eating, having a good appetite, all of these things that we kind of sometimes take for granted, right? So like I said, the body makes its own cannabinoids. And one of the ways to boost your body's ability to make its own cannabis molecules, and this has been demonstrated in studies, is to run, for example. So if you've ever experienced the runner's high, part of that is your body generating cannabis molecules. And so it's making you feel good because it's that runner's high. So part of that is a chemical called anandamide. Which is known as the bliss molecule. And so it's really interesting to think not only running, but also singing, dancing, and meditation in some of the studies have shown that will elevate the cannabinoids in your body. And so for people who are always coming to see me for medical cannabis, one of the things I always ask them for is, well, what is your lifestyle like? Because if you're doing some of these things, you could probably boost your body's cannabis system all on its own, which is even more natural than the plant. And so I always encourage those lifestyle factors because it will make you feel good from a natural perspective, even more so than consuming something. And every animal really has an endocannabinoid system. And so to my knowledge, there's no mammals out there or even animals or species out there that is surviving without an endocannabinoid system. So we think that to survive, it's necessary to have this system. We just probably don't fully understand, how complex it is in nature. And the cannabis plants, so those phytocannabinoids, they go and they bind to receptors in our body. And what's really, really interesting is there's two receptors that we know of today. There's hypotheses that we might actually have 6, 7, maybe 8 different cannabinoid receptors, but only 2 have been really proven. And that's the CB1 receptor and the CB2 receptor, just named cannabinoid 1 receptor, cannabinoid 2 receptor. And it was discovered because they wanted to figure out what THC, the molecule that has medicinal properties but also has recreational value, they wanted to figure out where it was going in the body, and they found that it was lighting up the brain. They found that it was binding in a lock and key fashion to these CB1 receptors in the brain. What's really interesting is a lot of drugs don't like to go to our brain, right? We have this blood-brain barrier we talk about so much in medicine, and we have a hard time penetrating that. But with cannabis, the moment you consume it, it's like welcome with open arms right to your brain. And so something's going on there. Is that good or bad? I don't know. Or maybe it's a little bit of both, right? And so we don't have all the answers, but cannabis definitely is very much welcomed into the brain very rapidly. And that's very interesting to think that nature has a plant that matches and mimics this complicated receptor system in our body. And for perspective, there's 1,000 more receptors for cannabis than opioids in your entire body. And in addition to the cannabinoid receptors in your brain, there's cannabinoid receptors in your immune system. So those are the 2 major areas. And so the receptors in the immune system are known as the CB2 receptors. THC also binds to these slightly. And so there's a potential target here. And so these are 2 big targets, right? We could potentially help brain disorders. We could potentially help a lot of immune conditions, and cancers may fall under those immune conditions, and a lot of the rheumatological immune conditions come to mind. And this is mostly potential, but this is something we need to be looking at because a lot of these diseases, we have therapies and a lot of them help, but if we can do better, we should do the research and understand it. what's really interesting about the receptors in the brain, and I've highlighted it here, is the brainstem. And so this is a very important part of your brain. It controls your ability to breathe. But what's fascinating about cannabis, despite it having so many receptors all over your brain, the one area it doesn't have receptors is your brainstem. And the reason, and the fascinating thing about that is you can consume high doses of cannabis, but you'll never overdose because you will not get respiratory depression. And so that's another just kind of very interesting point that, nature for some reason designed us so that we don't have those receptors in that specific area. And this is very different than opioid receptors or, where benzodiazepines like Ativan or clonazepam work, because they do work on the brainstem. And so the risk of an overdose and respiratory depression is there with those drugs. And so as a clinician who believes in harm reduction and first do no harm, I'm a bit of an advocate for cannabis, not because it has better science, because it doesn't, but because I know it's safer because there's no risk of overdose. And if it doesn't work, you can always go to those other pharmaceuticals later. So this is a really interesting point, and so that's kind of the good news about cannabis is you can have a very unpleasant experience, and by no means is it benign, but the good news is that once that experience is over, I know for sure you're not going to die from taking too much cannabis. So the cannabis plant, it's actually extremely complex. Botanical medicine in general is like super complex, right? And like the history of how we design all our drugs, and like I think 40 to 50% of the drugs we have, to my knowledge, they all come from a plant one way or another. And we study the plant and we try to find the most medicinal ingredient, and then maybe we synthesize a different chain on the side and study it. And we do this reductionism type of philosophy. And sometimes it works amazing, right? And it allows us to study them, and it targets a single receptor. So it makes it a little bit simpler for us to study. But botanical medicine is really complicated because there's over 500 ingredients in just one flower of cannabis. And so it's hard to study cannabis when there's 500 different ingredients, and strain to strain it could be different. And even as you grow it, the inputs could change. The amount of sunlight, the amount of nutrients can change what it produces in terms of strength of cannabinoids, for example. So botanical medicine is not easy to study by any means. The three major ingredients in the cannabis flower are phytocannabinoids, and those are the things like THC and CBD, and I think a lot of us have maybe heard those terms. But there's over 70 other ones that we still don't really understand what they do. They have some antimicrobial properties, antifungal properties, they have anti-diabetic properties, but can they be used as those? We don't know. We haven't studied it that way. And then there's these terpenes, and those are naturally occurring ingredients we find in our fruits and our vegetables. And some of those are things like limonene, which are in oranges and lemons, and they have some mood-enhancing properties, so they're supposed to elevate your mood slightly. And then things like linalool, which we find in lavender, and so some of us will spray lavender on the pillow because it helps us sleep a little bit better at night, so it's a little bit of a sedating type of molecule. But those molecules come in all these different ratios and proportions, and they can be combined with the cannabinoids, and you can get numerous different strains, and that's why some patients will say, well, if I use this strain, doc, it gives me energy and I feel energized, and if I use this strain, it makes me tired. Well, it's because they're two different medicines because they have different ingredients. And that's the complexity of cannabis, is we have to understand, well, what are the ingredients that are causing these different effects? And we have an understanding just because of databases of information, of anecdotal and observational information, but we need to study them in the lab a little bit better. And then the last category is flavonoids. And again, those are things, chemicals that we see in, like, again, foods or black pepper or spices, and they may or may not have medicinal properties. I think most of the flavonoids are really to add like aromas and flavors and scents and colors. So the two main cannabinoids, so despite the complexity of the plant, for whatever reason, cannabis takes its nutrients, it takes its light when it's being synthesized and growing, and it makes really two ingredients in the highest concentrations, and we believe these are the two most medicinal. Because they are made in the highest concentrations, and ironically, they're the two most studied cannabinoids. So THC and CBD, and there's a big difference between the two. And so THC is what we call psychoactive. Both CBD is also psychoactive. It's just not. There's no potential for impairment with CBD, but it does work on your brain. So it's important to note that both of the cannabinoids are working on your brain. It's just one has the chance to cause, we can use the word intoxication, I guess, if you took too much. And if you take too much, again, you can get euphoric, and some people will argue that's a medicinal effect, euphoria, and that the medical community kind of punishes or penalizes the euphoria sometimes, and sometimes that's a therapeutic effect. And you can imagine some of the side effects that we would typically see in some cannabis strains, like with THC, there's some transient amnesia, so you lose your memory temporarily. But you can imagine in like a soldier coming back from a war, like all they want to do is forget. And so sometimes we can leverage the side effects of some of these cannabinoids to palliate some of the symptoms that people are experiencing. THC has been demonstrated to help with muscle spasms, anxiety, insomnia, poor appetite, nausea, neuropathic pain, and mood. And it's important to note, and I'm going to talk about it later, is that it's all about the dose. So like many medicines, like sometimes one dose is medicinal and another dose could be recreational, and another dose could be, toxic. And it's the same thing with cannabis. Different dosages of different cannabinoids may produce different effects, and I definitely see when people take too much, they get all the paradoxical effects. All the things that THC helps with, they start getting counteractive effects because they're taking too much. CBD, on the other hand, it's not impairing, so even at high doses, people don't feel high, they don't feel stoned, there's no euphoria associated with it. It's mostly like a calm sensation feeling. Most people really use it as an anti-anxiety despite the very, very limited evidence of it, but that's what people are using it for. It also has a lot of anti-inflammatory, anti-epileptic properties. It also is a muscle relaxant and it's an antiemetic, so sometimes it can help with nausea, for example. What's really interesting about cannabis is like the THC is what we would call a propsychotic, so if you took too much of it, it has a very minor risk of causing psychosis in those with the predisposition. That's what probably the biggest side effect or risk that I worry about, and I really worry about it in young people who are smoking it and using high THC. So it's a very unique category that I typically worry about. But what's so interesting about the cannabis plant is like for every yin, there's a yang. And so with the THC, that's the risk. But in Israel, they did a big study on CBD, and they found that people with psychosis and schizophrenia who use high doses of CBD have improvements in their schizophrenia. So it's an antipsychotic, some of the other ingredients. So again, it's just more and more complexity about the cannabis plant. It has a yin and a yang, and they work differently on the receptors. And so this botanical medicine, I think at the end of it, you're going to realize it's just a complex thing to understand. Now, a lot of confusion is around, well, is THC recreational and CBD medicinal? Because sometimes that's the messaging, right? And it's like, oh, THC, you go to the store, you get high, off you go. CBD, you go to a doctor, you get that, and you help alleviate your symptoms. But the truth is they're both medicinal. It's just when you take too much THC and you're chasing a recreational value, then that's where you get recreational value. There's no recreational value to CBD. So both of them are medicinal. It's just THC has the potential to have a recreational value or get you high, let's say. Okay. When you look at the terpenes, so I talked about these briefly, but some of them are things like pinene and linalool and myrcene and limonene, and again, these are found in different parts of nature, and they have some basic science studies that demonstrate some medicinal properties. I won't go too much into it, but these combined with cannabinoids are thought to produce synergistic effects than just individual ingredients in the cannabis plant. And so this is really what I'm highlighting here is something known as the entourage effect. And so they've done some studies, and a lot of these studies are in children with epilepsy, and they do like the typical, let's call it the pharma approach, where you just take the one ingredient, the THC or the CBD, and you get rid of all the other ingredients. And then they give that to patients, and then they measure how effective it is. But then they keep the whole plant, and they give them all the cannabinoids, the major cannabinoid like CBD or THC, plus all the terpenes. And what they find is that the whole plant works better, and the side effects are actually more tolerable. And so it's really interesting. So with the cannabis plant, I'm really excited for all the research we're going to do, and I hope a lot of the money that's out there in this crazy marketplace is going to make its way into research. But cannabis may be one of those drugs that doesn't want to be made into a pharmaceutical, because so far the evidence is showing that as you try to isolate the ingredients and just create one ingredient, you don't get the same response as if you use the whole plant. And so this will have to bear out in the literature over the next few years, but so far most of it points to this effect, what we call the entourage effect, that all ingredients work better when they're together than just any single ingredient on its own. And so this is, just a really intimidating slide. And yeah, so all I want to demonstrate is that there's a lot of really interesting, and I think the right attitude around cannabis should be cautious optimism. I think we should be really optimistic that we're going to find a bunch of different medicines here, and then I think overall they're probably going to be proven to be relatively safe. But it's not going to be risk-free, and we definitely know that there are pockets of people who do get cannabis-related harms. But when you look at the basic science properties in cannabis, despite it not having the clinical trials and the data that we want, and that gold standard that we hold drugs to, it has way more basic science research than many drugs. And the truth is humans have experience with the cannabis plant for 10,000 years, right? So historically, there's been no medicine used longer in the history of the world than cannabis. And so hopefully that counts for something. We have experience with this, and it's hung around for a while because obviously it's working for some people with some conditions. But when you look at the chemical properties, it has antispasmodic properties, anti-ischemic properties, antiemetic properties, bacterial, diabetic, analgesic properties, bone-stimulating properties, immunosuppressive properties. And so this is really exciting, but we just don't know, just because something has an anti-inflammatory property, we don't know if that can treat inflammation and what doses we would need and what the risks and benefits are. But I think when I see something like this and I understand the science behind cannabinoids, it gets me excited that we need to study all of these things in humans and do trials to understand, well, which one of these are going to bear out as real medicines or not. When you look at the medical cannabis market, there's a bunch of different products that are available to patients. And so the first one is the flower. And so the flower you usually vaporize. We never advise patients to smoking it. Smoking has toxic byproducts. It's a little bit oxymoronic to smoke a medicine, in my opinion. And the truth is patients still do it, right? And so it's a little bit kind of, I'm knocking on my own head, knocking on their head usually. And the thing with vaporizing is it's safer, there's no toxic byproducts, and you actually use half the cannabis, so it becomes much more cost effective for patients, but some people just have a habit of smoking it, right? And there's this mixed medical, recreational user as well that's kind of in the middle. They're not a pure medical user, they're not a pure recreational user, but they have a complicated relationship with cannabis, and so spending time trying to tease that out is also a skill. So in our clinical practice, we've treated 60,000 patients across the country through about 20 to 30 clinics. And through that data set that we've collected, only 30% of our patients use the flower, vaporizing. Vaporizing is great because it works really fast. So it's good for things like incidental pain or incidental things that come up rather quickly that you need to immediately treat. And the lungs are a very effective way to deliver medicines, which is probably underutilized in my opinion. Really all we give drugs in the lungs are just puffers, really, right? So it's an underutilized area to deliver medicines, and it doesn't have to go through the liver, it doesn't have to compete with other drugs or be metabolized. So sometimes this is effective, and sometimes I do recommend it for patients depending on the symptoms that they have. But predominantly, most people are using oils or capsules now, and that's 70% of the patients that we see in our clinics are using the oils and the capsules. There's not really any difference between them. They come in standardized dosages. We give them advice on how much to take. And they're preferred, and I think it's just because it looks and feels a little bit more like a medicine. It's a little bit more comfortable than trying to learn how to use the machine, grind up flour, put it in. That's a little bit, ancient to us when it comes to medicine. And then there's other products that are going to be coming out, like topicals, potentially patches, and other technologies that are in the pharma space that may delay the onset of using cannabinoids or prolong their effect. And so this is just taking time. And we don't know if some of these drugs work or don't work. They haven't fully been studied. Thank you, that helps. So the two synthetic cannabinoids, so these are the pharmaceutical cannabinoids that you can get a prescription for as well. So the first one is nabilone. So it looks exactly like THC, but like I talked about earlier, it's just that one chemical. It's just THC. There's no other cannabinoids. There's no other terpenes. And look, this is approved in some pain guidelines to be used before opioids now. And that's off-label. It's actually really just approved for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, and usually people are failing multiple first and second line therapies before they use nabilone. But in my experience, and I used to prescribe a lot of nabilone maybe 2-3 years ago when cannabis was a little bit even foreign to myself, I used to prescribe a lot of nabilone. The guidelines recommend we prescribe it first before the herbal cannabis, but as I started to get experience, I realized that patients actually did better on the natural flower. They had less side effects, and the nabilone unfortunately would cause drowsiness and grogginess, which sometimes is beneficial if you're looking to get sleep benefit, but again, that would be off-label because it's really only indicated for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. But the good news is that nabilone is often covered usually by private insurance plans or government insurance plans, so there's a cost benefit to using it. Nabiximols or Sativex it's really interesting because it's a 1-to-1 THC CBD spray, so it has the natural ingredients, but it has a drug identification number. It's approved for MS spasticity or cancer-related pain that's not responsive to opioids. I would argue that that's a little bit backwards. We should use cannabis first, opioids last, but that's a whole other conversation for another day. But again, I don't think they have all the terpenes and the flavonoids, and so there may be different medicinal effects with this one. And the cost of this is usually not covered except for those 2 cases, and the cost is probably about 600 to 700% more than if you just bought the actual same oil from the Canadian producers. So I don't prescribe a lot of it just because of the financial barrier. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the science and do my best to illustrate what we know and what we don't know. So the problem with cannabis evidence is it's really hard to draw good conclusions that demonstrate it works, and there's difficulties in demonstrating that it doesn't work. So the problem is that there's access bias. So in the United States, who does a lot of research, if you want to get cannabis, it has to come from the National Institute of Drug and Abuse, NIDA, and then their flowers are very weak cannabis. It's not grown properly, and you can only study that one type of cannabis, so they're kind of restricting what you can study. And truthfully, the people that fund them profit off of private prisons and all these other things. Then there's research and funding bias. So if you look in the literature at the primary outcomes on cannabis, 90% of the studies were trying to prove something was bad about cannabis when only 5 to 10% received funding if they were trying to prove something was good. So you're only going to find what you look for, okay? So we need to do more studies that demonstrate the benefits potentially of cannabis that patients are telling us. Then there's selection bias. So a lot of the studies are done in recreational users who are self-administering the cannabis, not being coached or taught by, let's say, clinicians. And so it's hard to take the data on recreational users and say this is what's going to apply to medical users because their use pattern and products are completely different. So we can't extrapolate that data. And then there's confirmation bias, and this is probably the biggest one. And I've noticed it shift in the last 4 to 5 years. Like I used to get up and give talks to rooms of physicians, and I would make people's heads spin at the beginning 4 years ago, and slowly with time I started to see more and more acceptance and more understanding, and as we get more and more experience, we can kind of confront some of the biases that we all have internally, right? And the fact is that like I was only taught that there's only harms to cannabis many, many years ago, and it's taken me my own research, my own time, my own experience to realize that that's not true, that there are many patients that benefit from it. So if I was just stuck in my own bias of what I believed and refused to accept new information that came available, that's a confirmation bias that we have to confront. And what's really interesting in the United States, even though cannabis is a Schedule I drug, there is a patent by the US government because they have demonstrated in the lab that cannabinoids have neuroprotective properties and potentially could be used in a lot of brain disorders. So it's a little confusing, right? It's illegal when it's beneficial to them, and it's also a medicine when it's beneficial to them because they can have a patent on it. So that kind of adds to the confusion around cannabis. So the best research is really this study, The Health Effects of Cannabinoids. It's available for free on the internet. It's a 400-page document. I won't go through 400 pages. We'll just go through the key points. So there's really only 3 or 4 conditions that have what I would say placebo-controlled decent evidence, and that's chronic pain, and that subset is really neuropathic pain that has the best evidence. And then MS-related spasticity, chemotherapy-induced nausea, and then there's some moderate evidence, not as significant for insomnia related to other symptoms and such. And I would say since this has been published, we've had more randomized placebo-controlled trials in epilepsy, and so I would say the evidence for epilepsy with CBD use is getting up there as well. In terms of the harms of cannabis, it's really complicated. There's a lot of associations that we don't know what we can and can't draw from it. But we do know that smoking it leads to bronchitis. We don't know that if it leads to lung disease, but I do think it will be proven eventually. I've met people who've smoked cannabis their whole life and have COPD, and they've never smoked cigarettes. So I've seen it with my own eyes, but the data has to catch up to that. There is concerns about using it as a pregnant mother, about how it can affect the baby and development, and there's concerns in young people under the age of 25 as the brain is developing. We don't know if you target this endocannabinoid system, what happens. And so we do know that the earlier you use cannabis in life, the higher the THC you use cannabis in life, there is an association with a higher risk of psychosis later in life. And so I really try to not prescribe cannabis to under 25 unless they have a really debilitating condition and the risks outweigh the benefits. The benefits outweigh the risks. Yeah. And then, of course, if you smoke cannabis, it slows down a lot of your motor coordination, so there is a 200 to 400% increased risk of a car accident after using. The laws say you should not be driving after using THC for at least 4 to 6 hours if you're inhaling it, and potentially 6 to 8 hours if you're ingesting it. And so there is an increased risk. So that's where the best evidence is. And if you go through that document, it goes through like 20 conditions, and it gives you a good summary of it. And so the different methods of consumption, there's ingestion and vaporizing are the two most popular, but there's a lot of different methods that patients use. We just don't know if they work. So the lungs and the gut are really the two ways that we deliver cannabis. And like I said earlier, inhaling, it works really fast, and it lasts, unfortunately, a short period, 2 to 3 hours. If you ingest it, it gets metabolized, and the effects can be 30 minutes to 2 hours to kick in, and it can last about 5 to 8 hours. So chronic diseases with chronic symptoms should really be treated with oils and capsules, and acute issues or episodic issues should be treated with more fast-acting cannabinoids, which would be vaporized cannabis. Again, we don't recommend smoking. There's major differences between smoking and vaporizing. At the end of the day, vaporizing is more effective, more efficient, and a much safer method than smoking it. So the patients get a lot of lecturing from me if they're smoking it. So what about the benefits and risks? So therapeutic index is like a measure of how lethal a drug is versus its therapeutic window. And so how much can we accidentally give somebody before they die? And so the higher the ratio, the safer the drug. And with cannabis, because they have none of those brainstem receptors, to produce a toxic effect in your body, like I think, yeah, you'd have to smoke 1,500 pounds of marijuana within 15 minutes, okay? So that's like 1,500 Snoop Dogs couldn't do that, right? So yeah, like it doesn't mean, again, yeah, it doesn't mean it's safe. I see people like, okay, I'm up for the challenge. Yeah, and so so there's no lethal dose of cannabis, but yeah, if you smoked, even 1% of that amount, like you're gonna have really, really bad side effects, okay? It doesn't mean it's benign, it just means from a toxicology point of view, it's not killing or harming cells in your body, okay? And it's not gonna lead to a lethal overdose. And there are many prescription drugs that we prescribe that also have high therapeutic windows, but there's also other ones that we prescribe that are very tightly controlled. And if you get too much of it, then you can have, bad side effects. And then, so look, THC, that ingredient in cannabis, it activates dopamine, so it is rewarding your brain. And so whenever you're rewarding your brain and you're not doing something like exercising or meditating, and you're getting the reward easily, you have to worry about, well, is this an addictive thing? And yes, THC is addictive. The good news is that it's about as addictive as caffeine. And so about 9 to 11% of people will have some type of dependence on THC, and it's in a very select population we see. And it's really interesting. Some of the statistics I've read recently is that like 60 to 70% of the cannabis in like recreational markets is only used by like 8 to 10% of people. So obviously there's like this small group of people that use a huge amount of cannabis. And so we need to understand and tease out why that is. There are other drugs that are far more addictive or cause a lot more dependence. But yeah, THC is not benign. It does have some addictive potential, but it's overly, I would argue, is not substantial compared to other things like opioids. If you look at the side effects of cannabis, CBD is extremely, extremely well tolerated. It's been studied in many, many children. It's been studied in epilepsy cases, and it's usually typically extremely well tolerated. So CBD is one of those things that I rarely worry about. Like, there's no contraindications to my knowledge to the trial of CBD. There's just also not a lot of good evidence to say that if you take it, it's going to work, right? And so right now it's being advertised as a little bit of a panacea, and so you just have to be skeptical and you have to be careful. There's no guarantee it's going to work, but there's probably a good guarantee that it's not going to harm you. The worst thing that's going to harm is your wallet for a temporary period of time, truthfully, okay? And they are expensive, and I'll illustrate that as well. The side effects all come from THC, and it's from using too much THC. Low doses of THC, 1, 2, 3, 4 milligrams of THC, are usually very well tolerated by the vast majority of patients. But if you do take too much THC, whether it's inhaled or ingested, you can get common side effects, which are drowsiness, dizziness, dry mouth, and they say that your heart rate can increase between 7 and 9 beats per minute. And of course, if you have clogged arteries in your heart, we don't want to put the heart under stress, and so that can trigger certain things. And then euphoria or high, especially if you're inhaling a big dose. So less common side effects would be some of these paradoxical effects, so nausea and vomiting. So There's this cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome that I've illustrated at the bottom. It's extremely rare, but emerge docs see it, where people come in and they're vomiting every morning and they're taking hot showers, and they refuse usually to stop their cannabis because they're like, no, it doesn't make sense. Cannabis helps nausea and vomiting. Well, yes, cannabis does, but if you take too much, it does the opposite. It's this paradoxical effect. So you need to understand and have somebody helping you do that. But most people who have very minimal experience, they're never going to experience some of those rare harms if they're getting the coaching and they're dosing it properly. You do get some mild amnesia if you're using THC. You can get paranoid or anxious if you take too much THC as well, and I've seen patients have bad experiences. Hallucinations and psychosis, that's probably the biggest risk that we worry about. Some of the studies illustrate that 23,000 people would have to use cannabis to have one psychotic episode. So the number needed to harm would be 1 in 23,000, which is a pretty good number. So it's exceptionally rare, but it does happen. Okay, so briefly, just the cannabis system. So there's a recreational cannabis system. You go to the store, you buy it, do what you want with it on a Saturday night or whatever you'd like, just no different than if you bought a beer and you enjoyed that with your dinner. But if you're looking to medicate with cannabis, the proper way to get cannabis is through the medical cannabis system, through Health Canada regulated licensed producer. It's a very complicated system. It is not easy to navigate, and clinicians really have to help patients navigate it because cannabis, unfortunately, is not regulated like a pharmaceutical, and so they have all these checks and balances and extra paperwork and has to come in the mail. There's a lot of nuances and a lot of annoyances, truthfully, and so patients really need a lot of help. And so usually you see a clinician. Nurse practitioners can also prescribe cannabis in Ontario. They write you what's called an authorization. It's not a prescription. It looks and feels like a prescription, and it's held to that standard, but it's called an authorization, and it has a limitation on how much you can and can't order and the strength of THC that's limited. And then you get it in the mail. You have to order it online or make a phone call. So the pharmacies aren't yet set up to distribute cannabis. So again, those are the most common products, and the cost can be $100 to $300 a month. And very few people are covering it. I have seen in maybe the last 2 to 3 months more and more Manulife, Sun Life forms coming in, and there's usually 4 or 5 conditions, the ones with the best evidence that I talked about earlier. And I'm seeing boxes now where I can check off as a physician, and my patients are getting coverage now for cannabis if you meet those 4 or 5 criteria. But if you don't meet those 4 or 5 criteria, usually you're having to explain yourself, copy some evidence, and they'll have to approve it on a one-off basis. But the vast majority are paying out of pocket. 95% of patients are paying out of pocket, and it's expensive. It can be $100 to $300 a month, and if it works and it's working really well for you, it's extremely frustrating when you got to spend $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year on cannabis. When it comes to harm reduction, one of the major things I do in my clinic is talk about if we're going to use cannabis, trying to get you off of other drugs, especially if cannabis can help with the pain or the anxiety. And what's really interesting is that opioids really are an epidemic because the majority of the heroin users out there start with a prescription for prescription opioids, so 86%. And so the more I can delay prescriptions for opioids or get people off opioids, I hope to make some type of contribution to this. And so you can see that the deaths for opioids continue to rise and rise. And so cannabis is definitely not like a cure-all for the opioid crisis. It's just part of the solution. It's really a harm reduction approach. So in the US, 22,000 deaths. This was a study that was done to say, well, if you use cannabis, what are you doing with your other drugs when you use cannabis? So this is just self-reported patient data, 271 patients. 63% of people who use cannabis substitute for prescription drugs. 25% stop using alcohol, 12% tobacco, 3% illicit drugs. And the main categories are pain and mental health. And so people are saying, when I use cannabis, I use less opioids, I use less benzodiazepines, I use less antidepressants. I don't usually tell people to come off their antidepressants if they're helping them, but a lot of patients will if the cannabis, for whatever reason, is helping with their mood. And it may just be helping with the pain, which then is helping with the mood. So I'm just going to wrap up now in this case. And so myeloma and cannabinoids. So these are a lot of the common symptoms that people may come in with myeloma. So chronic pain, fatigue, anemia, recurrent infections, nausea, vomiting, potentially kidney disease and malignant cells. So one of the things that I just really want to quickly illustrate is that this whole cannabis cures cancer thing. And so you see this everywhere, and all these famous people have stories, and people are blasting their tumors with cannabis oil, right? And so, okay. So yeah, it's just important to know, like, people come in all the time asking me to help them with their cancer, right? And it's just important to know that, there's not really good evidence for this. Does cannabis have anti-cancer properties? Yes, but those have been studied really in animal models, and we don't understand if it translates to different types of diseases. And so does, like, broccoli and blueberries have anti-cancer properties as well, but it doesn't mean if you have a broccoli blueberry smoothie every single day that your cancer is going to shrink, right? It may be good for you, and it makes sense that it's good for you, but there's no guarantee that it's going to have an effect on your disease. It's never been studied that way. And so, using cannabis to treat any type of cancer without using conventional therapies is quite risky and dangerous. There are studies going on, and there's some early studies in brain cancers that look really good. It is showing longevity of life when you use cannabis with chemo compared to just the chemo group. But those are really early trials, and so we need to tease out what it can and can't do. There might be some anti-cancer properties here. There might be some cancer drugs here, but the extent of it we don't know. And today it's really used only for symptom management because that's where the best science is. And so going back to those symptoms, so the main symptoms, if you were dealing with myeloma, that cannabis might help with would be probably some of the chronic pain, potentially fatigue, and nausea and vomiting. And so they may only help. And I can't say that cannabis definitely helps all of my patients. There's some that have remarkable results with cannabis, and there's many that spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars and they do not get a response. And so we don't understand who are responders and who are not responders, and it's really just a trial and error. It's a therapeutic trial. What it's not going to help with is probably not going to help with any of these symptoms, okay? So just to finish with this case now, so Peter was a 72-year-old male living with myeloma, had chronic pain, insomnia, anxiety. So we started him on a CBD oil. He's never used cannabis, so people who are naive to cannabis, I always start on CBD. There's no reason to use THC, always do no harm first. And then we did use a tiny, tiny amount of CBD with THC at night because that's the one that's a little bit more sedating. And so when he came back to see me, he had 50% improvement in his daytime pain and anxiety, a slight improvement in the fatigue. He reported a major improvement in the insomnia. He was paying about $200 a month for this regimen. And some of the side effects he did report were that he had a dry mouth, as I do right now too, mild dizziness. And one of the things is that if you wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and you do have THC in your system, you can feel off balance, dizzy. And so it's really important that you're careful when you wake up in the middle of the night with any drug potentially that has those side effects so you don't fall, right? That'd be the worst thing. So in this case, yes, this person was a responder. They responded well, and it did help them with a lot of their symptoms, and they felt their quality of life improved. So in summary, when dosed properly, cannabis is mostly safe. But it also has the potential to cause side effects, and that's THC. The science so far helps it support the use for pain, insomnia, nausea, vomiting, and there's an immense amount of research that still needs to take place. Cannabis is usually not covered, and the cost can be $100 to $300 a month. Unfortunately, there's no evidence to date that cannabis is a drug for myeloma itself or any cancer for itself. There are ongoing studies in myeloma combining them with some of the drugs, and it'll be interesting to see what the results are, but we're years away from understanding that. Thank you.